Chris and I have known each other for a number of years, and can I introduce you? And then
Sure.
you could introduce me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Christopher Michno is currently the assistant director of Pitzer Art Galleries, and he's also a writer and an editor. We work together at two different places, Artillery Magazine and also DoppleHouse Press, which is a publishing company that I own. I've known Chris for a long time in these editorial capacities, but this is the first time we're engaging about my actual artwork.
As Carrie said, we've known each other a long time. My first exposure to Carrie's work was when Carl Berg had an exhibition space in the Pacific Design Center. I can't remember what year it was, like 2009-ish. And Carrie's installation there was putting some ephemera from one of the performances that you had made, and then a video to accompany. It was the documentation was Carrie bouncing up and down on a trampoline. Her work in graduate school really evolved around her body in space as it moves through space, and then it evolved through a long series of investigations into what you see here, which is thinking about vessels traveling through space as kind of an extension of the gallery white cube, and also thinking of the body as a laboratory, as astronauts become experimental subjects in kind of thinking about space travel or extraterrestrial travel. But there's much more to the work here. Carrie's MFA is from UC Irvine. I'm trying to find where, oh, here we are.
The whole thing by the imagery.
Yeah, I'll abbreviate it. Carrie's MFA is from UC Irvine. Before that, she studied literature at Yale University. As she mentioned, she's the publisher and proprietor of DoppleHouse Press, which publishes memoir and art and architecture books, as well as fiction and other types of books. So that covers a lot.
That covers a lot.
Yeah.
That covers a lot, and more we will discover, I'm
Right.
sure, because this is probably going to be a freewheeling conversation, and it'd be great if you guys have anything to say in the middle. Just raise your hand. It's going to be very organic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if everyone here's gotten a chance to kind of go into the show. Not yet. Yeah, feel free to wander in there as we're talking, you know, whatever you want to do.
I feel like that helps.
So, should we start with the Copernican model? Because I'm interested in unpacking how that addresses kind of your interest in just conceiving of our place in the universe and decentering the terrestrial-centric model of the solar system, but also just the sense of humanity as the center of the universe.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. This piece, it's great. Chris made an annotated version so we can actually show the work as we're talking about it. This piece is in the back corner, and it's a 6-layered sphere that is a series of integral bottles. It's something I actually have a patent on with the glass blower that helped me make it. And I think one of the important things to know about this is actually a little bit of history about how Bob made the glass blower and I came to actually make these. I had wanted to make a model of the solar system in a bottle that could also reference human gestation. So 9 months, 9 planets. This is before they kicked Pluto out of the system. So now we're, 8, 9. But I have one 9-layer bottle and then these 2 6-layer bottles. Bob took on the project because he said, oh, I don't know if I can do this, but if we can do it, we have to do it as you drew it. So he wanted to try it. Later, he confessed to me that he had heard of something like this, having been made before at Los Alamos, which is where his glassblowing mentor worked. So this is during H-bomb research, and they were trying to figure out how to make multiple visible with an F, materials contained in one space that you could then bomb something with, which is just horrible. But it never left the lab. It was just a story. It was radioactive, apparently. Bob knew about it. And then his father was actually an amateur perfumer. So in addition to being a scientist, Bob had this background with perfume. So he had his father's perfume sitting up in a high shelf in the middle of Norwalk, California, in an industrial park. He was making industrial glass, huge spheres for chemical companies. And he took on this project for these personal reasons, and it took years to actually make these and make it work. And then now he's done. He's given everything away, so there will be no more of these. He has ways of doing it that are very difficult. In the process of making them, a graduate student at Cal State Fullerton, where I was teaching, introduced me to the work of Lakoff and Johnson, who are two cognitive scientists. And there's a model that they have of human cognitive behavior. And it's literally spheres within spheres, and thinking about the way that our minds actually work, that we conceive of ourselves, our thinking selves within bodies, within society, within the world. And then you can kind of just keep building that out ad infinitum to, I don't know, some mysterious container in which we all exist. I was really interested in that, and I have to thank Athena very much for introducing me to their work. The deeper I read into this, I just was fascinated by the way that scientists throughout history have combined the study of the stars with this philosophy and the study of the self. And so our thinking process about who we are in the universe has also involved thinking about the actual stars and working with the math to try to figure out where we are in space and time. But as you said, decentering the human, like the human being the center of everything, this model also works as an atomic model, which is that connection to the hydrogen bomb, which you look at it and it's both macrostructure and a microstructure, and it's us, and it's not us, and the center is everywhere, but it's also in each of us. There's something very bizarre that I learned that probably a lot of you have heard of, but I'll just say it anyway, that the center of the universe is anywhere that you are in the universe. So there's that idea that the center is everywhere and the circumference is nowhere to be found. I love that. You can't encompass it.
Right. Which is, I mean, this is interesting because it seems to be that your project, whether this is inadvertent or kind of a byproduct of the research that you've done over the years, is really attempting to maybe account for the history of cosmologies that have emerged in Western thinking, but also thinking speculatively about what might be next. And so, you're reflecting back on these anthropocentric notions of our centrality to the universe, which comes from a kind of theocratic or a kind of theological model of thinking about the universe, but also the great chain of being. And then kind of this idea of the expanding universe, that wherever you attempt to measure it, you find yourself at the center, which seems impossible, right? So there's this notion that while we're capable of beginning to measure these things, we still don't have an understanding of how they actually work.
There's a lot of unknowns. I think that's what I love in science, math, astronomy. There's just this constant quest.
Yeah. So can you talk about how that relates to, there's a couple of other pieces in the show, the window pieces that reference these kind of, for lack of a better term, 30,000 foot views, or this kind of these broad conceptualizations of trying to understand the universe in this way, like the long eye view piece.
Yeah. So the window piece, that's kind of the title for the show, is bonsai. That bonsai piece that had two different kinds of trees in it, and I imagined it up on the International Space Station. It was printed in a couple papers and in National Geographic, so online National Geographic. But the idea for this piece comes from space psychology studies that have revealed that astronauts can get into a place where they actually develop long eye syndrome, and they need to have this constant connection with the planet, and they're attached to the window in kind of unproductive ways. Astronauts have very busy schedules, but someone's always going to the window. If I can connect that to this other piece here in the other window, which was probably the last piece that we installed here and a bit tricky, there's kind of an unsolvable aspect to that long view, because you can look and look and look into the distance, and you've never really solved the end. There's no end in what we, I think, as humans are trained to do, which is to look out across the savannah or whatever and determine what's where, and do some wayfinding and orientation, look for threats, look for possible benefits, resources. That's kind of what we do. But this other piece is called What Happened Backward, and it's actually trying to put you on the other side of time and think about how could you see your origin point, and how do you determine that if you only have bits of clues in history. It was inspired by stone skipping, but I've had people come in and say, well, obviously it's emanating from the rock, it's these energy waves that are coming towards you. And I thought about it as something that was both linear, it's linear in kind of two directions, but it's also presenting that sense of circular time, which hopefully this bonsai also kind of lets you in on that idea. Because if you're up there with your small companion plant spinning around the earth faster, I think it's sunset every 6 hours or something. There's something very fast. I don't know the exact timing. But that completely changes your perception of what nature is, what growth is, what seasons are, what humans are, what our bodies are. And there's no way to really situate a time and place for the human when you're displaced from Earth. So that displacement is kind of central to the questions in the show. It's also part of the perfumery, right? That once you smell something or unleash a sense out, it disperses and it disappears, but it has a trace, and you kind of can follow it as it changes over time. I'm very interested in that.
So I'll pivot here to the question of humans' nomadic behavior, right? And so we're talking now about like leaving this Earth, which is our home planet, and venturing out into the stars. I mean, we're not there yet, but this has been sort of the grand narrative of the last 50 years, right? And
way before.
Sure.
Everything in the Russian cosmology, trajectory that led to the cosmonauts is there, and it's back in the Greeks, and everybody wanted to see themselves out in the hard crystalline spheres. That's what Aristotle considered the heavens were. The stars were arranged on hard crystalline spheres. That was also a nice thing that I read after I'd made these bottles.
So there are pieces in this exhibition that are mnemonic devices for home, right? To kind of alleviate the hard effects on the human body of traveling in space. And so can you talk a little bit about how you made that turn and how those parts of the exhibition developed, and maybe like what sense they are?
Yeah, so I'm gonna throw a curveball in here because I'm gonna make this super personal. That you're talking about nomadic people and moving, and then how did I bring that together with the idea of home and traces of home and wanting to bring home with you. And that comes from very literally my family experience being part of the Jewish diaspora and having had to leave, my father's family had to leave Europe in World War II. Is very lucky that he was adopted by a family in Australia. There's actually a piece in there about a rock that reminds me of the rock my dad found that reminded him of Australia. And there's a sense of memory of home that kind of, even if that was not your original home, you kind of gather these homes with you and you transmit them on to the next generation as you're moving. So I had this crazy dream where I was floating above the earth, and you can just imagine, just like an astronaut out there. But then I realized I have this cord that's kind of like going back to earth, and all of a sudden I get this tug, and then I'm like being rocketed downward toward the planet, and I realize it's an umbilical cord. And then I wake up before I hit. But there was something in there for me. It's a little Kubrick space child thing, but also the feeling that it's really impossible to do this. It's impossible to leave home. There's no way humans are going to survive off this planet. I really think that the billionaires, good luck to you going out to Mars and surviving. Bring lots of sperm because it's just not going to work out very well. I'm so frustrated with the, the kind of techno-capitalist conversation around space. So just to separate ourselves from that, what I'm really curious about is the way that as an artist, writer, or science fiction filmmakers, we can use the idea of space to bring forth all these other things that are happening right now.
Going back to the sense that you created, because one of the pieces is this astronaut homesickness kit, which is on this wall when you walk in, and this kind of unfolds as if it were kind of a round Rubik's Cube or something like that, right? And
it's like orange slices, but yes, very much that sense of a puzzle.
Yeah, and so it's designed to contain scents that have been emulsified in beeswax, yes?
Yes.
So can you talk about where those scents came from, how you created them, what the history of where they come from?
Yes, so the scents, these are 8 different scents that were chosen out of like the top 20, apparently, that by a United Nations long-term survey project were determined to be the most important to humans. And this was research done by a very talented perfumer named Dr. Gail Knowles. And I found out about her research, talked to her many times, and asked her if she could lend some of her research to this project. So we found 8 different scents that seemed like they would go well together. So that doesn't include like coffee and chocolate, which are definitely in there. And they include things like lemon and pine, birch, linden blossom, jasmine, rose. These are very common in perfumery, but they're also just incredibly potent memory triggers for all of us, I think, for all those things that I've just said, maybe with the exception of linden blossom, which is pretty geographically specific, but you all probably have some specific memories related to those. So each of them are on their own, but together they make a perfume. The perfume is just the traces of what's left from when I made this in 2013. There's literally just like resin at the bottom, but if you pull off the cap, you can get some of that. And I think it's the yellow one. But there was another one in the same box that said home sickness kit. So I assume there were 2 versions. I really can't remember, but there's 2 bottles in there. They smell quite different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have to throw you a curveball.
Do it.
Back. It's like when we were talking before, you mentioned kind of how perfumers will add a particular scent in very, very small concentrations to their scents.
The poop scent.
Yes.
I know you were going to go there.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to everyone.
Right.
Yes. Indolol is called. Might even be up on these shelves somewhere. These are the Institute for Art and Olfaction has this amazing reference library. But there is a fecal odor that perfumers use in tiny amounts that kind of creates this nose curiosity, and it's really buried deeply in a sense. You know, some scents have musky aspects to them or sort of darker colors, and makes you kind of want to go back in there. On the map on the wall in there, which is called the Chemisphere drawing, there it's featured in the southern sky up to the left. You can see the organic chemistry itself.
Right. So what I envision this is like your brain alerting, wait, did I just...
Yeah, let's check that out.
Right.
Let's make sure it's not on my shoe.
And then you go back and you smell the other parts of the scent.
Right.
But there's a tie-in because, like in the paper that you wrote about what is it called?
Green solutions for
Yes.
astronaut headspace. I think it's called.
Yeah, astronautical headspace. Yeah, so there you quote one of the astronauts as saying that after a certain time in space he just couldn't stand his own company just because you're in an enclosed box with however many other individuals and
All stinking together.
right, and you don't have a chance to bathe properly, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, how does this? I mean, aside from the obvious,
How does it take care of that
how
problem?
does it take care of that problem?
Well,
but
I think-
the other, I mean, beyond that,
Yes.
I mean, this is part one of the question.
Okay.
Beyond that, like, what are the other things that they're not really part of this exhibit, but what are some of the other things that you addressed in that paper?
So addressing scent in space. First of all, when you're in microgravity, all the fluids move into your heads, and so you don't really smell that much. But you are stinking, but pretty soon you don't smell anything because that's just almost like a defense mechanism. It's funny, not intentionally. So anything that you would smell has to be really strong, and astronauts need to eat foods that are, they like really spicy foods that are pungent, things that have a lot of texture, biting into something crunchy. These are all like godsends for the astronaut, because if you're just eating mushy mush, like that's the end of life. Like something with salt, something with spice, something with tang, you need all that stuff to activate your brain and keep you happy. The homesickness kit doesn't really address that, but I have thought that it's very interesting. A paper was written just recently with a co-author, somebody who's been aware of my work, and they actually cite me somewhere in the paper, deep in the paper. But it's a group, the co-author is at JPL, but the group that developed this device is in South Korea, and they are very interested in one particular smell, which is geosmin, and it's in here, and it's the smell of wet earth. And it's super strong, and you know what it is when you smell it. If you have it on a little smelling stick and you take it home, you get sick of it super fast because it just inundates you. But apparently this can be used as an antidepressant. So they developed this little tiny like inhaler, almost like a vape thing, where you could have geosmin, and there's one other component that makes something called petrichor. So this is really fascinating. It's kind of a relationship to the homesickness kit, but literally addressing mental disturbance in space. So I guess I had already kind of built that into the addressing astronaut headspace with green solutions, because I had envisioned this bio helmet where you could like pop up inside of there and you'd be in the middle of kind of a bonsai forest, and there would be mosses and earth, and during the opening people were like up into the Australia rock, this little moss garden, you know, like oh yeah, earth, I smell wet earth, real natural smell, but it is something you want to smell. It is a thing.
Yeah.
Did I go off?
No, I mean, this is all good. I'm going to save the three-body problem for the end, but
Okay.
but I am interested in kind of talking about these works, the Rossler system, which is this piece right here with the rocks and bridges, and the 5-axis time machine, which has a kind of a collage of various depictions of gardens and bridges. And can you...
Both of those from a Chinese calendar. This was also
Yes.
kind of my site-specific piece for Chinatown. But this calendar came to me from a printer in Hong Kong that we use for my publishing company. And they had sent me these just gorgeous calendars, but I started really being interested in the rocks and like cutting the rocks out and then putting all the rocks together, and then I realized like, oh, it's pretty interesting when you change up the seasons and you put the seasons together, and they developed into these two different collages. But they both had this relationship to time that I was really wanting to explore a little bit further in a way that I do, which is I go online, I start looking at fractal systems and dynamical models, and there were these animations that were insane for the Lorentz attractor, which models atmospheric currents, and this particular one, the Rossler system, which is dealing with wave oscillations and electricity, and it just really made sense to me. Time, maybe it's kind of abstract now, but to put rocks and it into this flow of time, into something that cannot be locked down. Because we see a rock, and this relates to the sort of Zen koan piece out there in the window. You see a rock and you think, that's it, it's a rock, it's a thing, it's so stable, and it's not, it's just moving. It's just moving at a much slower pace than any of us are. So over the course of eons, this rock goes from mud to uplift, glacial, wearing away into a river, being tumbled in a river, getting buried again, scooped up, made into gravel. I mean, the rock is always changing. These rocks are always changing. So putting together like a really fast time system with really slow time system seemed to also be a good way to reflect on how the artists and by the way, the artists for all of these pieces of Chinese calendar, their little stamps are still, I put the stamps in there, so I don't know their names, but their stamps are in there. it seemed to be a good way to talk about how these artists have related to these natural scapes over time, because over years, these same landscapes have been painted, and then those paintings have been repainted. And even in these calendars, there's this scene, and the scene involves a banquet, and at the banquet there's a screen. So it's of an 18th century banquet, and the banquet has a screen, and in the screen is the same landscape that is in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this sort of memory of a space that's never necessarily visited by the artist, but they're visiting their own art history again and again and again.
Right.
For sure. So it's not my art history, but I'm certainly fascinated by it. Since I was a little kid, I've always had little miniature things, little Chinese miniature things. It's always been something that's captivated me.
Right. Your statement for the exhibition references various contemplative practices, and there's a number of them that you use in this exhibition. One is the kind of rock skipping, which is also referenced in the work that's in the window. Looking for the title.
The title isn't that important.
Yeah, but
it's called "What Happened Backwards." But that was my attempt at bringing history and philosophy into this.
I also wanted to kind of ask you about the connection to the possibility of skipping off of atmospheres, which
right, we talked about that.
We talked about
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad you're bringing that back. Yes. So when I was studying the stone skipping, I found this amazing video of this world record holding can do 88 skips of a stone guy who this documentarian put together with a group in Utah doing fluids research. And they have these videos and they're studying exactly how the stones skip. And I didn't know this, but the stone is like hitting the water and creating a wave. And the energy of the wave grabs the stone and gives it enough energy to get to the next place. So that's why the flatness is important on the skipping stone, because it has to impact with that wave and get like maximal amount of energy to go to the next skip. But the fluids research people were like, yes, this is really important to study, because if we're going to send, say, spacecraft to Titan and the atmosphere is very thick, you might want to know about these dynamics so that you could skip off the atmosphere in a certain way in order to get to your specific destination on the planet where you wanted to go in.
So it's a way to in some ways, to make space travel more efficient, right?
It's about efficiency.
Yeah.
But not for the billionaires. For this, we're talking about like the good old government-funded NASA research project to find out if there could be life on Titan. It's possible.
It is possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, let's bring it back to the contemplative practices, because there are a number of others, and like, can you talk about why that's important to you and how it matters within the context of this show?
Okay. Contemplative practices are important to me personally because I've found that I think more clearly when my mind is clear, and your mind can be cleared by doing repetitive things in a conscious and intentional way. And whether those are movements or whether that's weeding, weeding can be contemplative practice. It's pretty great. Whether, for some people, prayer beads, lighting incense and using that as a way to access parts of your memory or parts of your brain. I don't know what else did I put on. I love the skipping stones and like stargazing, cloud watching. These kind of activities definitely help us get out of ourselves. And that's where I think creativity lies. The homesickness kit, that idea came to me while I was on a hike. I know exactly where I was. It was like coming around this corner, and I just thought, that's what I need to make. And it just comes in a flash, and then it takes years to work out like how you actually do it. But that I'm interested in what happens when you open space in the brain, and the brain has this information. We have this information in our bodies, body brain. I don't really believe in that, like, you know, brain within body, like it's all one system. But the contemplative practices are kind of like a quieting of certain nervous impulses so that you can release other information.
Yeah. So do you view particular artworks in this exhibition as part of like mnemonic devices or devices that transport you into those contemplative spaces, and which ones?
Well, definitely these two. These are just ones that I've just made. Combining pieces, it's kind of like editing, Chris. Really, I don't really like starting with a blank paper and like drawing stuff, but taking something someone else has done, completely taking it apart and putting it back together, this is like editing. I just love the process so much. So collage became that for sure. And also the fact, I hope people that haven't had a chance go in and pick up that red piece and use, it's called 5-axis system because you actually have 5 axes when you use all of your limbs. I was thinking, I need to get like a little robot that would do, and then I was like, no, people can pick it up. They can just do it their own. Besides the 5 axes robots they're like $10,000. Yeah.
Well, you need a little sign on there that invites people to interact with it.
I think sneaky people do it.
They do.
Yeah.
But that,
please handle carefully. Maybe something like that.
Yeah. There are plenty of other people who will be like,
would just be like,
art.
Art.
Exactly.
Well, that the armillary sphere that's here in the beginning, which is a bunch of silver rings, that was machined also with Bob Bates. It's really great to move around and spin and do all sorts of stuff with. But you can leave it in all sorts of conditions, right? So this is just to give it the best presence. But because this is just like, this piece is pretty simple, like almost like a gimbal, like a compass on a ship. You can keep turning it and that center piece kind of stays where it is unless you really contort it. You can get to the backside. That piece is simple enough that it's always going to end up being put down in a kind of acceptable way. But the homesickness kit, same thing. You want to move that around, take it apart, put it back together again. That's really fun. Except it gets really hard if you move the pieces around, because then it's not the actual constellations anymore. There's a very specifically painted celestial sphere, ours, which is on there. So if I let everybody play with it, inevitably we get it all mixed up, and I don't want that.
Yeah.
I do still like order in the universe.
You don't have a solution key at home?
You need to just look at constellations.
Yeah. But I mean, just like an order of operations that will get you.
No.
No. All right.
Mm-hmm. Flying blind.
Yeah. Okay. That's the programmatic aspect
that you would like. You would like a key.
I would like a key.
Okay. I'll work on that.
Thank you. So the 3-body solution, the root, the crown, the amber. I mean, I think this could be like one of the most charged parts of the conversation.
It could be, or also could just be like, ooh, yummy.
Okay.
I've had people go in and smell those and really enjoy them. But this is the first time I've made 3 scents that go together into one. So it's a tripartite scent, and it's got a bottle that it's the first time I've made a scent also for that bottle. would be much more challenging to make one for the 6-layer sphere. I don't know how you make 6 scents. The homesickness kit was 8, but they were individual, lemon, pine, that's one perfume made of 8 parts.
Okay.
But to make 3 perfumes that also make a 4th was a different challenge.
Yeah. Well, and so when you, I'm curious about the actual physical process of making the perfumes, because we talked about it in relation to the homesickness kit and like what kinds of materials you started out with, because you were very clear to say these are not chemically derived scents.
They're not the broken down individual molecules. On here, there are some of those. Are really important in perfumery. Those particular scents are all made of woods. There are about 8 different kinds of woods.
And they were steamed and...
Some of them are steam distilled, and then I think there are other processes that are used as well. There's one, there's frankincense and myrrh and styrax, and styrax is impossible. It's just this syrup. It's thicker than syrup. It's just sap. So even to work with it, you have to microwave it for like a minute and then quickly mix it with alcohol and try to get it to dissolve and to be something that you could actually spread around. So they're not all the same kinds of materials, but they all come from woods, and that whole piece is really trying to bring a solution forward in history using these different forms of philosophy and trying to put them all together and use their best parts and have us think about the tree as an informational system that can really lead us forward in a time of crisis in which we are.
So as a metaphorical structure for how we think of
ourselves, how we think of the world, how we think of memory, how we think of growth and change. You said controversial. I'm just going to go right there, Chris. There's that real problem with Heidegger at the moment. Heidegger and all of his, Nazi ideology and his blood and soil extremism that saw the tree in the acorn, and that the acorn is part of the potential, and the nation grows from the soil, the Vulcan soil, and it grows and has a potential, and it has to manifest itself in history. And that philosophy is all over nation state building, just everywhere. And all the revolutionary philosophies that have taken from Heidegger, including jihad, kamikazes, different forms of revolution. I will just, the Jacobin terror is a little bit earlier, but part of that same strain of revolutionary philosophies. I think we're in a place where those don't help us at this time. That's where the root is. The crown idea kind of comes from the ancient Greeks, and this idea of the perfect tree, the tree that is already an ideal whole in and of itself. But the crown, we know that democracy is really an imperfect thing based in the Greeks' idea of, democracy was for voting men, right? The women slaves, you weren't allowed to vote and be part of this. But I'm very interested in the amber, the third element, which is like the memory and the living structure in the tree and what communicates between the root and the crown, and where all of the energy and the food sources are located. And the amber is my favorite part of that scent also. It has also relationship to my own family tree. There are some scents in there that remind me of different people in my own family. And what else? I think I'll just go right for the part, what I think is a fun part, which is that when I was designing this, I had a whole demonstration piece that I was going to bring in here. I was going to bring in this little pot with an acorn seed that was growing into a little oak tree that I had in my backyard because a squirrel forgot his acorn. And I saw it and I was like, scoop, and I put it in a little pot and I was going to bring it in. It was going to be my talking point. And then just a week or so ago, the squirrel came by, saw that I had taken his acorn and put it in a pot. And he came and he literally just cut it. He just snipped it and he left. There was the whole, little beginning of the tree and the seed underneath there, and he just separated the two and left that for me. So this passive aggressive moment of the squirrel, squirrel ate my talking point, brings us to still the interesting idea that you could have a perfect oak tree in a bonsai pot, and it could be nomadic, and it could move all around, and it could be taken into outer space. And this wonderful, perfect tree has to be made perfect by you every day, maintaining it. Working in bonsai, it is an exercise in futility. These trees are always trying to branch out and do something against your design. They're always there's always diseases and fungi, and you have to change the soil and clip the roots and keep it nice in its pot. It's a constant exercise in care. And that's the relationship that I'm interested in. The squirrel is the curveball that's coming in and doesn't agree with your plan at all. The squirrel is like the argument in this, right? It's not a harmonious. My idea is very harmonious, right. But there's always going to be a squirrel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to come back to the metaphor, the political metaphor, the sociological metaphor, how do you have conversations with people? I know this is way beyond the scope of your exhibition, but I mean, really, I am very curious, how do we have conversations where we're able to hold ideas in tension? We talked about this earlier. I mean, it's alluded to in this expanding model of the universe where everywhere is the center, but nowhere is the center. And Tycho Brahe's attempt to smooth out the differences between the Copernican model and the Ptolemaic model of the solar system.
Is the Earth the center, or is the sun the center? And maybe it can both be true if we draw it this very convoluted way, and everything is going around everything else. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we have conversations where people can't talk to each other?
I think the first thing is that you have to manifest something that's in agreement. There's always some commonality. There's always some common point. And especially if you are having a disagreement with your immediate neighbor or your family member or something, there's still something that you share. There's something that you can start to build on. And there's always going to be a squirrel, but you gotta work hard to try to make that into something positive that can grow. And I think that's where we could leave it in a real general way.
Yeah.
But artists are great. They make these impossible drawings, and like Tycho Brahe, imagining cosmologies and ways of things working. That's not actually how they work, but for the moment, it's a structure that helps you get to the next stage.
Right. Well, he was so instrumental to advancing astronomy. Just in terms of developing instrumentation, repeating experiments to kind of verify the data, various things like that. So the fact that he kind of made this impossible model of the solar system that didn't really reflect what was going on is kind of a side note in his history.
And I like looking at that, and I like thinking that he was marrying two ideas that were incompatible, but in the same drawing. So in a sense, he allowed for that transition, and that that drawing, which has, I think it's Saturn and Jupiter going around the sun, and the sun is going around the Earth with the inner planets, and there's this strange overlap, kind of like how those rings in the stone skipping piece are interpenetrating. They're kind of affecting each other, but not. So it's impossible, but as an art piece, it says something else about where we were in time. So that's what I hope art can do for the conversation. At least mark something in time, provide a place where people can see themselves reflected. Whether they're reading the rock as being the origin of history or the result.
Yeah. Would you like to take any questions?
I would love to if people are hanging around, so let's do it. We're at 7. If we can, maybe spend 15 minutes. Your parking is an issue.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
So from a spiritual aspect,
Yes.
I think of the squirrel as God,
Nice.
because you have plans that you want to achieve, you're working towards them, and then there's, somebody throws a wrench in your plans, and then you gotta okay, now what?
Well, let me just say, the squirrel loves to plant. Definitely the wrench. Comes and plants in my bonsai, digs little holes and puts his acorns in there. So it's like a completely destructive force. But the fact that I had tried to touch his acorn brought the wrath down, even harder. So there is something about going with the flow of the destruction, even just like let it happen. Let those acorns be where they are. He's valuable for something. He's doing some good work somewhere.
He's planting oak trees.
Yeah, somewhere.
My oaks.
I'm trying to grapple with some cognitive dissonance here.
Okay, great.
I'm sure you like it. If we love humanity, we have to preserve it. Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay. You can answer.
Okay. Yeah, I
'Cause I was
think we
gonna
could be
say-
temporary. We can be temporary in time.
Yeah, like as a species, if we don't leave the planet, we're gonna get destroyed.
Eventually.
That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But if we leave the planet, what makes us human?
It's a very good question. I like that phrasing.
I think it's more likely we'll destroy ourselves when we leave the planet since we need to.
Yeah, I had this very depressing thought a few months ago. I just thought, well, we're not going to destroy the planet. We're going to kill each other first. That's just pretty clear. There's nothing to worry about, Earth. You're going to have it back at this rate.
Yeah. What stage? We'll not only destroy ourselves, but many other
Creatures are going to.
species. Yes. Yeah. Which I would have to kind of side with it. We have a moral obligation to do everything we can to save the planet, but I know that that's not where the momentum is.
There are these Russians from the early 20th century. I'm reading about them right now. I can't remember this guy's name, but they have this whole thing about death is the ultimate affront to humanity, and we have to solve death. And one of the ways they're going to do it is figure out how to detach the planet from the sun, so that the planet can just freely roam and be free of any destructive influence. Because the sun, somebody was tracking. This is really fun. Okay, they was tracking the incidences of wars, revolutions, overthrows, societal disturbances in relationship to massive solar flares, and the relationship of solar flares to these human-induced catastrophes are very close. This year we're having a massive solar flare, by the way. We're in the middle of this. Who knows what this means? But I wish I had brought in this book. They're called the Cosmists, the Russian Cosmism. And it's Boris Groys, I think, has just put together some of their writings in English for the first time. So I'm reading this stuff, and the solar flare thing just I mean, that's written 100 years ago, but they're studying the Napoleonic Wars and anyway.
You said that was
Check it out.
early 20th century?
Mhm.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And then they were, heavily disliked by Stalin. So there was some rewriting of their and suppression of their work. But they influenced the whole cosmonaut program. Yeah.
I was going to ask, are you familiar with Hermeticism or the idea of like Hasami Savant's as above, so below, as the universe, so the soul?
I love that.
It's like, you mentioned fractals, and then in Hermeticism, there's that idea that, like we are little universes of our own, and we are part of nature, and, like there's no telling as to the size of, someone's world, you know what I mean? Like a little ant,
Right.
or like a little microscopic universe,
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can go down a lot of paths from
totally.
here, like into string theory and universes folded within all the space that's here. But I also learned in Chinese, traditional Chinese medicine theory of the way the qi travels through the body, that you have all these systems for different electrical pattern travel through all the channels. But in your hands and your feet, you have reflected all of those organs as well as in your ears. And this one acupuncturist, she said to me, oh yes, your ear, your hands and your feet, they're fractals. She uses the word fractal. And so that tripped me out. You have to look more into that. But if you look, your fist kind of looks like your heart. There are some things that are interesting. The ear looks like a fetus. I mean, I don't know.
Well, like brain synapses look like the universe, or like
They do. They look like the cosmic
Our veins
web.
look like delta rivers. You know what I mean? There's so many like macro, micro, fractal ideas that are really interesting.
You see the world like I do. Like you see structures repeated in different ways, and I think that's from a sculptural aspect. That's an infinitely interesting way to see the world. Yeah.
Carrie, can you talk a little bit about how you collaborate with scientists?
Yes. So accidentally, in some ways I'm seeking them out. I'm asking questions that are maybe dumb questions, but then we get into a conversation that they realize they can learn something from me and I can learn something from them. There have been different ways that I've met people. For example, in 2008, I think I was invited to be part of this restaging of an ice sculpture in MacArthur Park. That was something that was being done through MoCA. And I'm going to embarrass myself if I try to remember that artist's name out loud. But it was something that was done in the 60s, and then we were redoing it with a bunch of kids in MacArthur Park. And there was a scientist that was involved in this named Christopher Box, and he's an atmospheric research scientist. And I started to talk to him about Mars, and then I found out he was doing things with the nitrogen cycle and looking at whether there's bacteria that are creating these different nitrogen cycles. So I visited him there, we started talking, and we ended up doing a couple lectures together, which were kind of fun because it was like the artist saying one thing, the scientist saying something else in the same slide presentation, and there was kind of collisions of language, very difficult to actually say things in the same language, but like you were saying, there's
right brain,
structure.
left brain.
Kind of, yeah. Until it falls apart and then it doesn't work anymore. But it's fun for a little while. There were 2 members of the German Space Agency that were brought on by a space architect in Vienna who I had started to work with on a paper about, of all things, plants in space. And I wrote the bonsai section for a paper And then she folded in these guys from the German Space Agency to really give some background on the way that plants are actually grown in space. And we developed the mobile plant cultivation system in a history of how plants have been used by astronauts in space. So that was another way to work with the glassblower here, he's an engineer, inventor. You know, that was just me after Cal State Fullerton working with their glassblowing people and some of my students on multiple things that just fell apart. And, you know, it was fun, but we weren't getting anywhere. So I started looking for other glassblowers, and it was just happenstance to walk in and find Bob Maiden and have him be so receptive and then have him be so talented. That's been a long-term friendship and partnership. I know you work with scientists.
Yeah,
So.
no, I mean, it's all different depending on, you know, whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah, and then sometimes they're more receptive than others, right?
Yes. The fact that you met somebody at that, you know, a scientist who's helping with an art installation, that's already a clue.
Right. He's already cool. Yeah.
He's interested in art.
But I met some really interesting people. You're at Caltech, so I met some interesting. This is Hillary Mushkin, by the way, great artist, and she's at Caltech. And I met somebody in the ice lab that was really interested. You guys used to have, I don't know if you still do, have all those core samples from Antarctica. There's a really interesting scientist at JPL who studies ice, and I'm really interested in her work because it's like on Enceladus and, you know, is there life somewhere? There's a whole other SETI aspect to what I'm doing. But that scientist took me to Caltech, and we went to the ice lab. And if you've never been to the ice lab, go.
Is it Bethany Allen? Oh, we can talk about this later. Yeah, I don't know that. Well, I'm here. I don't know that.
Okay. Ice cores from Antarctica.
Yeah.
That's fucking cool.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? I don't want to cut off other questions.
I have one more.
Okay.
Is it something like xenoosmology, like xenobiology, that if there were alien species, alien planets, what kinds of senses would they have? How would their senses not be?
That is an interesting question, and one that we have approached at the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence conference that I went to, and talked about what kind of messages you could send in space that could be recognized. And chemistry was up there, you know, but do you send the periodic table? Look how smart I am. Like, these scientists really want to do stuff like that. Send the whole internet, you know, like, send all of, you know, Bach. Like, look how smart we are. Instead of like, my idea was like, send some kind of like chemical poem, some kind of perfume, something that relates to us and our sensibilities and our sensitivities and things. And then the question was like, well, what if it's like trees? It's like, well, yeah, so can you create a scent communication with trees? Probably. We haven't done that necessarily yet, but there's a project for anybody who wants it. All right, well with that, let's wrap up, and thank you all for coming.